sur l'émergence de l'Afrique, un des mots d'ordre de base de type prédicat prérequis était que l'Afrique, abordant les rives de l'émergence, devait s'assurer d'abord et avant tout de vivre dans un contexte qui soit apaisé, sécuritaire, et nous venons d'apprendre, évidemment, hier soir, tout le monde a suivi les événements, qu'en Tunisie, il s'est passé, l'extrême et l'horrible est arrivé. Je souhaiterais inviter l'ensemble des présents et des présentes ici à respecter une minute de silence à la mémoire des victimes de ce scandale. Merci pour avoir accepté de partager avec nos frères tunisiens, nos frères africains. Oui, c'est malheureux qu'on n'ait pas installé les... Oui, d'accord, mais... Ok, est-ce que ça va mieux comme ça? Oui. Alors, merci. Merci en tout cas d'avoir bien voulu accepter de partager avec nous ce moment de solidarité qui nous a permis d'exprimer symboliquement notre attachement à la paix, à la sécurité, à la stabilité en Afrique. Et lorsque l'une des pointes avancées de l'Afrique, en le format qu'est notre République sœur juste à côté, nous Algériens, nous sommes aussi affectés que l'est le peuple tunisien, pour dire à l'antique Ifriqiya, c'est-à-dire qui porte le nom de l'Afrique, la Tunisie actuelle, toute notre solidarité et notre rejet de toute forme d'extrémisme qui s'est manifesté à travers ce qui est arrivé, qui était immonde hier. Alors nous avons... pour aborder notre session, si vous permettez, et avec la permission de mon ami Tertius Zongo comme modérateur, je vais me permettre de rappeler, sans trop m'appesantir à cet égard, un certain nombre de prédicats que nous avons posés, de perspectives paradigmatiques que nous avons envisagées lors des deux précédentes sessions, et qui nous ont donné à voir, en effet, l'essentiel des plateformes qui portent les prérequis et qui se rattachent à différentes fonctions fondamentales pour envisager le passage et la transition de l'Afrique vers l'émergence. Et nous avons visité ainsi l'ensemble du tronc conceptuel et de tout ce que cela supposait comme méthodologie, comme outillage. Et aujourd'hui, avec cette session, ce matin, avec cette session, nous abordons en réalité les rivages de l'économie réelle, parce qu'il s'agit évidemment de considérer les conditions dans lesquelles prennent place les fonctions éminemment décisives et importantes de la production et de la consommation, mais encore davantage pour envisager l'hypothèse qui est de plus en plus, je veux dire, qui s'inscrit dans des réalités et dans des vécus qui sont celles que permet de lire les pratiques dans beaucoup de nos pays, et en particulier dans ce pays qui accueille cette conférence internationale sur l'émergence de l'Afrique, pour dire que c'est demain, c'est déjà aujourd'hui, et donc nous allons aborder ces questions-là sous différents angles qui vont effectivement nous permettre de revisiter ce qui a été évoqué hier et avant-hier en termes de comment noircir la matrice industrielle, comment envisager de mettre en place les input-output, comment réaliser l'ensemble veiller à ce que les logiques s'installent pour que, en effet, au terme d'un effort considérable tendu vers cette émergence via les fonctions décisives de la production et de la consommation, permet en fait d'établir les liaisons essentielles et non moins décisives, qui sont celles de relier les inputs à l'échelle naturellement de la sous-région, de la région, du continent africain, et puis réunir le tout pour le faire rejoindre les chaînes de valorisation à l'échelle régionale, à l'échelle continentale et à l'échelle mondiale. Et je crois que c'est un fait établi que désormais, le knowledge economy va être déterminant pour s'assurer que nous sommes effectivement dans cette voie de l'émergence, parce que c'est sur cette ligne du savoir, de l'économie fondée sur la connaissance, de la société du savoir, que se construit le mieux et s'élabore le mieux, le plus efficacement possible, la valeur ajoutée et les capacités d'une valeur ajoutée de plus en plus croissante. C'est sur cette ligne de la knowledge economy que nous constatons que la valeur ajoutée est la plus déterminante et de plus en plus, évidemment. Et je crois que les théoriciens en sont d'accord de l'économie. Le sort de l'humanité va se jouer également sur cette ligne tout à fait décisive. Alors voilà, je ne vais pas davantage retenir l'auditoire sur ces évocations. Je laisserai évidemment mon frère Tertius prendre le relais en sa qualité et en sa fonction de modérateur de ces débats propres à cette session aujourd'hui, ce matin. Et puis nous aurons certainement l'occasion aussi d'évoquer tout à l'heure un certain nombre de choses qui sont restées pour le moment dans une pénombre ou dans des zones qu'il va falloir de plus en plus éclairer. Voilà, merci beaucoup de votre attention et merci d'avoir été là et d'avoir été patient pour attendre les uns et les autres, dont moi-même, je ne sais pas pourquoi, mais je pensais que c'était à 9h30. Et puis naturellement, notre intervenante phare, puisque c'est à travers son intervention que nous allons vivre elle va poser les jalons à la fois théorique, conceptuelle et d'ordre pratique qui permettent d'entrer dans cette boîte noire qui est celle de construire et d'élaborer tout ce qui doit l'être sous l'empire de on va vers l'émergence. Merci beaucoup.
Alors merci au président qui, d'une manière évidente, me facilite la tâche de modérateur. Je crois qu'il a fait déjà les commentaires que le modérateur devait faire. Donc la session de ce matin, cette plénière, est consacrée à l'émergence et les changements des modes de production et de consommation. Et nous allons avoir comme intervenante principale Madame Pounan de la Banque mondiale qui fera l'exposé principal. Et nous allons avoir un partage d'expériences qui nous viendront des présentateurs que je prendrai le temps de présenter au moment où ils vont venir pour gagner du temps. Vous savez que l'émergence, c'est d'abord une question de discipline, c'est une question d'organisation. Si on n'est pas discipliné, si on n'est pas organisé, on peut beau crier l'émergence, on ne l'aura jamais. Nos sessions sont des sessions d'1h45 et je souhaiterais que dans la mesure du possible, que nous puissions respecter ces 1h45 pour permettre aux autres aussi d'aller dans le fond de leur session. Donc, nous allons essayer de gérer le temps. Le président à mes côtés, il est un grand habitué de ces grandes rencontres et je pense que nous allons pouvoir le faire. Alors, cette session, je souhaiterais que les intervenants, et principalement Mme Pounan, puisse nous parler un peu des moteurs de la croissance et de leurs limites. Nous sommes en train de parler des modes de production et de consommation. Donc, quels ont été les moteurs de croissance en Afrique? Comment les choses ont évolué selon les différents secteurs, que ce soit le secteur agricole, l'industrie, les services? Quelles sont les limites? Est-ce que l'espérance dans laquelle nous sommes plongés, est-ce qu'elle est vraiment durable si le chemin de transformation sur lequel nous sommes engagés n'est pas changé? Le deuxième élément qui me semble important que nous pouvons aborder, ce sont les enseignements qu'on tire des expériences que nous avons eues en Afrique et ailleurs, et voir comment nous pouvons avancer vers des modèles de transformation qui soient beaucoup plus inclusifs, qui prennent la grande partie de la population et surtout celle qui vit dans la pauvreté. Parce que l'émergence, c'est ça. Nous reviendrons un peu sur ces questions. Et peut-être pour être très court, je souhaiterais aussi qu'on voit quels sont les cadres institutionnels que les pays africains doivent mettre en place pour accélérer, je veux dire, les initiatives d'intégration régionale. Parce qu'on ne peut pas parler de développement, de croissance, de création de bien-être sans parler de marché, sans parler d'intégration. Et pour finir, comment ces nouveaux cadres que nous allons mettre en place, quand ces cadres permettent d'accélérer l'intégration, comment elles peuvent permettre de nous installer dans une industrialisation qui soit une industrialisation inclusive et créatrice de valeur ajoutée. Voilà quelques questions auxquelles je souhaiterais qu'on puisse apporter des réponses. Et sans tarder, je vais donner la parole à Mme Pounan pour son exposé.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and distinguished guests and participants. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and doubly so to be able to talk about the emergence of Africa on the global stage. This is something that's very dear to my heart. I've been studying Africa and the rise of Africa for several years now, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to share some thoughts and insights with you. I'm basically going to cover three topics: Africa's economic rise, the pattern of Africa's growth and poverty reduction, and finally, how to make Africa's growth more inclusive and the role of structural transformation. Just bear with me, please.
You have 20 minutes, don't forget.
Okay, hold on. I'm not sure why this is not moving. Okay. I think it's working. So first, Africa's rise. Now, the region has been enjoying 2 decades of robust economic growth, with GDP averaging about 4.4% a year over the period 1995 to 2014. And this represents a remarkable turnaround for the region from the subpar growth performance of the previous 20 years, that is the 1975 to 1994 period, when regional growth was under 1.5% per year on average. And what's interesting is that the analysis of Africa's growth pattern shows that growth spurts have become more frequent, longer lasting, and have a faster pace of expansion. And the good news is that after lagging for 2 decades, in the mid-70s, the mid-1990s, Africa's growth rate is now comparable to that of the rest of the developing world. Another notable feature of Africa's growth is that it's been broad-based, which means we have seen growth in both resource-rich countries as well as non-resource-rich countries. And by resource-rich, I mean extractives. And also, we find that amongst the non-resource-rich countries, there are several countries that have grown at a fairly rapid pace. For example, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda that have average GDP growth rates of 7% or better since 1995. And African countries are now routinely amongst the fastest growing countries in the world. For example, Cote d'Ivoire has average GDP growth of around 9% a year in the past 3 years. So that's good news indeed. And thanks to this rapid growth in the region, aggregate output at the regional level has doubled in real terms since 1995, and in 2013 it was $1.6 trillion, with a per capita income of over $1,000. Of course, recent rebasing of GDP numbers, for example, in Nigeria and before that in Ghana and several other countries, shows that perhaps the official numbers understate the actual size of these economies. But I don't want to cover the shortcomings of African statistics today because I think these are well documented. But just to bear in mind that whenever there's been a rebasing, we found that the GDP has actually been larger. Now, overall, Africa now boasts about 22 middle-income countries. That means a per capita income of more than $1,045. And by 2025, we expect another 10 countries to join these ranks. And there could even be more if countries grow at even faster pace. And reflecting the dynamism of the region, a handful of African countries like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and Zambia have joined the ranks of the so-called frontier markets, or the new set of emerging markets. Now, that was the good news. Now for some caveats to Africa's growth story. First, on a per capita basis, GDP growth has been less impressive. Actually, so as I was saying, the growth has been less impressive on a per capita basis, and this is because of the rapid population growth in the region, which averages about 2.65% a year, underpinned by fertility rates that are the highest in any of the developing regions of the world. And this has translated into only a moderate pace of per capita GDP growth, averaging less than 2%. A year in this period of 1995 to 2014. Remember that GDP growth was averaged at about 4.4%. The result has been that on a per capita basis, the increase in real terms has only been about 40% or less over this period. While Africa's sustained output growth has reversed the income decline of the lost decades, as I was talking about, the mid-1970s, the mid-1990s, you will see that the pace of per capita GDP growth has actually been below that of other developing countries. So whereas on an aggregate basis, GDP growth has caught up with the rest of the developing world, we find that on a per capita basis, it has not, it lags. And that's one of the reasons is because of the rapid growth in population. So it's not converging to the growth rate of the rest of the developing world. Of course, I think it's important to remember that there's heterogeneity across countries. We have faster pace of growth of per capita incomes in resource-rich countries as compared to non-resource-rich countries. Now, the second reason is that, I just want to go back to this slide. Despite the sustained growth in output, we find that growth has not been very good at moving people out of poverty, and poverty has remained stubbornly high in Africa. The incidence of extreme poverty, that is people living under $1.25 per day on purchasing power parity basis, the incidence rate was nearly 60% in 1993, and it has fallen to about 47% in 2011. This is much slower than the pace of poverty reduction in the rest of the world. And indeed, The region has achieved only about 35% of the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal, poverty target of halving the proportion of people living in extreme poverty, while globally this target has already been met. So Africa is definitely lagging in reducing poverty. And because of the increase in population, even though the incidence of poverty, meaning the poverty rate has fallen, the actual number of people who are living in poverty has gone up. In 2011, which was the latest year for data, it was almost 415 million people living in extreme poverty. As we said, slow progress on poverty reduction is partly because population growth slowed the output growth on a per capita basis. But it's also because growth has not benefited the poor enough. And we find that in Africa, the conversion of growth into poverty reduction is much slower than in the rest of the developing world. We estimate that the growth elasticity of poverty in Africa is minus 0.7 compared to the developing country average of around minus 2. So that means growth has 1/3 the impact of reducing poverty in Africa than it would have in the rest of the world. So in essence, you have to get even more growth to get the kind of poverty reduction that we have seen in the rest of the world. I think the third issue to look at is that the pattern of growth has been uneven across sectors, with little structural transformation or structural change. Now, historically, development has been underpinned by structural transformation out of agriculture and into manufacturing. And this is what happened in East Asia. But Africa's structural transformation process has been different, with a shift out of agriculture and into services and bypassing manufacturing. Africa's pattern of growth has raised concerns over the sustainability of this growth, and we'll discuss that in some detail. But basically, Africa's industrial growth has largely been driven by natural resources, and manufacturing has scarcely taken off in the region. So what do we find? In 2 decades of rapid growth, the economic structure has changed of the region, with shifts in the sectoral composition of growth. And when we look at it in terms of growth in agriculture, industry, and services, where you see agriculture is the slowest growing, services, the green line, is the fastest growing, and industry is also grown, but we will look into it a little more carefully. But basically, the services sector has grown at the fastest pace, averaging about 2.6% growth per year on a per capita basis over this period that we've been looking at. And growth of industry has been lower at about 1.7%, and then in agriculture, per capita growth has lagged substantially at less than 1%. As I was saying, there is a divergence within the industry sector. If you look at manufacturing and natural resources, which is the extractive sector. And most of that growth that we see in industry is actually coming out of the growth of the extractive sector within Africa, and it's not coming from the manufacturing sector. So what has been the result of this pattern of growth? We find that the share of services sector in output has grown from 49% to 55% in 2011. And that in terms of when you look at other sectors, for example, agriculture has declined, which they're falling to about 15%. But very interestingly, you'll see that industry sector has seen a decline overall in its share of GDP from 33% to 30%. And as I said, when you drill down further, we find that this is really benefiting from the boom in natural resources, while the share of manufacturing in GDP has actually shrunk to under 10%. Now, Africa's pattern differs very much from that of other developing countries, and one notable way in which it differs is that in other developing countries, the share of the industry in output has actually increased from 36% in 1995 to 39% in 2011, and that manufacturing share has been maintained. So there is that notable difference. Of course, even in the rest of the developing world, you find that the services share in output is large, and that of agriculture has been declining. So the next thing we want to look at is employment and jobs. But before I go there, just very quickly, Africa's exports have also shown little evidence of diversification, which sort of reinforces this narrative of limited structural transformation. And usually we find that as countries are going, from low income to middle and higher income, there is a diversification of exports, either into newer products or even within commodities to better quality of existing products. But we find that in Africa, this has not been happening, and that actually the concentration of commodities, especially fuels and metals, has increased. And the share of primary commodities in exports is very high at 75%, with, as I was saying, the share of fuels and metals gaining, whereas that of agricultural commodities has declined. So turning now to jobs and how Africa's structural change has impacted jobs and where people are working. There is some evidence to show that there has been movement of workers out of the agriculture sector and into services, but not into manufacturing. What we find is that 4 out of 5 workers are still are employed in agriculture, although agriculture accounts for less than 1/6 of output. So nearly 60% of the labor force continues to be employed in this sector. And what is more, agriculture employs an overwhelmingly large number of poor workers, almost 80%. And whereas the percent of poor in industry and services is much less, at 5% and 16% respectively. So this means that most Africans continue to work in the sort of traditional sector, which is also the informal sector, non-wage employment in farming and non-farm small household enterprises. And as you'll see again, when we do the comparison with other developing countries, these numbers, the shares are much lower in terms of the distribution of labor, with agriculture accounting for 37% of employment, manufacturing for 24%, and services for 40% in the rest of the world. So Africa's pattern of growth raises concerns about the sustainability of this growth. Africa's process of structural change has been different from that of other countries and not the kind of transformation that was expected. Now, according to the standard literature on structural transformation, as economies develop, there's a reallocation of resources across sectors, causing labor to shift from low productivity sectors and jobs to high productivity ones. And for poor countries, this has typically meant moving out of the traditional sector, such as agriculture, to modern sectors such as manufacturing, as was witnessed in East Asia's growth takeoff. But the experience of Africa is quite different, with both declining shares of GDP and manufacturing, as you saw earlier, while the services sector has grown. So the services sector, which is both formal and informal, but predominantly informal, has been absorbing workers and capital in most countries, with much of the growth in services being in low productivity activities in the informal sector. Okay. Now, there is some empirical evidence that's been done, to show that structural change or structural transformation has contributed to labor productivity growth. So we do see that if you decompose labor productivity growth for 16 countries, we don't the data, detailed data are not available for more. That over the period 1995 to 2009, that the shift of labor from a lower producing or lower productivity sector to a higher productivity sector accounts for half of the overall growth in labor productivity during this period. And we know that if you have intersectoral movement from lower productivity to higher productivity sectors, this unleashes growth. But in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, this has happened to a lesser scale. And even then, within countries, there's a fair amount of variation, as you'll see. Mauritius is quite different in terms of what has happened in terms of productivity gains within the modern services sector. And in Nigeria, there has been movement from one sector to another, but still in the informal area. And some countries have actually seen a decline in labor productivity. But there is evidence from developing countries that suggests that the gap between agricultural productivity and productivity in the non-agricultural sector is quite large. This is for a range of developing countries, not just for sub-Saharan Africa. But that shows that at lower levels of income, there is potential for the movement from one sector to another, from the lower productivity sector to the higher productivity sector, which can unleash growth. Now, the overall lack of industrialization in Africa's growth boom has raised concerns about the sustainability of this growth. And one key debate is over whether sustainable growth requires a shift in favor of manufacturing, or whether countries can move up the quality ladder in sectors where they can exploit current patterns of comparative advantage to sustain growth. And yet another part of the debate is whether you can shift into high productivity services as experienced in India, bypassing manufacturing altogether. So is that another path of sustainable growth? And I think this is an area where a lot more research it can be done and would be welcome. I want to turn to the pattern of growth and poverty reduction. Okay, I'm going to move really fast now. I just want to flag an issue of the sectoral composition of growth, that where growth is taking place matters in terms of poverty reduction. If it didn't, then it wouldn't matter which sector was growing faster, whether it was agriculture or industry or services. But it does matter which one is growing, because where the poor are, that sector, if it grows faster, is likely to reduce poverty much faster than sectors which don't employ the poor, or where if growth is taking place in areas where the poor do not live and have difficulty to access opportunities and jobs there. So I think it's very important to see that the pattern of growth has implications for poverty reduction. And there is evidence at the international level that shows that. For example, comparing three countries, Brazil, China, and India, we see that China in China, growth in agricultural sector has been exceptionally pro-poor, where poor farmers' access to agricultural land facilitated their participation in agricultural growth. But in Brazil and China, access of the poor to land is limited, and it's the service sector growth that had been most poverty reducing. In Africa, we do find evidence at the country level, for example, in Ethiopia, that agriculture has had a greater impact in terms of reducing poverty than other sectors. And this is something that I won't bother you with, but just very briefly, cross-country analysis for both sub-Saharan Africa and other regions show that in Africa, it's really services sector and agriculture that has been effective in reducing poverty, and very little of the reduction in poverty has come from the industry sector. And that is to be understood. I mean, that's understandable because we know that very few people are employed in industry, and in that, very few poor people are employed there. So let me see if I can skip. So we come to this important issue of how to make Africa's growth more inclusive and the role for structural transformation there. And we know that Africa's growth needs to be more inclusive because poverty is very high. It's at about 48%. And faster poverty reduction will require Africa's growth to be more inclusive if it's going to be sustainable. But the issue here is it structural transformation out of agriculture, in particular out of manufacturing and modern sectors that's the answer? Or is the answer more nuanced? And there are several dimensions that African countries can pursue in terms of reducing poverty. And here we'd like to say that when you look at the evidence, you find that it's really growth in almost 80% of the poor are in agriculture, and agriculture continues to have low productivity and not growing fast enough. So clearly, there needs to be a focus on improving productivity in agriculture. So first and foremost, in terms of making growth more inclusive and lifting people out of poverty, there needs to be a focus on improving productivity of agriculture. And here, I don't think there are any straight answers. There are several policy interventions that will be country-specific and depend on the country context, whether the focus should be on input subsidies or improved seed varieties, extension services, irrigation techniques, access to credit, connectivity to markets. These are going to vary in terms of what is going to be the policy prescription. And what really needs to be done is to look at it in the country context and have more research in this area to help African countries unleash the potential of growing agriculture. And within that, there's also the trade-off whether it's smallholder staple crop productivity as opposed to exports that are found to be more poverty reducing. 2 minutes? Okay. All right. So 2 minutes. The second important point that I'd like to focus on is that I think it's important to also grow the rural economy to allow for diversification of income within the rural economy so that there are increased and better jobs in the rural economy, which will help farmers and people working in agriculture to supplement incomes as well as transition to the more formal sectors and to, at some stage, urbanization. And finally, this doesn't mean leaving manufacturing. I think it's very important to focus on manufacturing and increasing the productivity of manufacturing. Here, I think it's well known that African manufacturing is constrained by a number of sort of structural factors, such as skills gap of labor. And the region needs to build human capital for the 21st century, not the last century. Infrastructure deficits are very large in the region, especially in terms of reliable and affordable access to electrical power. And of course, high transport costs and trading costs also weigh heavily on competitiveness, as well as costly market regulations. So it's important, I think, and I'm going to conclude, that there needs to be a focus on all three, not just on growing one particular sector, but of course it depends on country context. But Africa is well positioned for the 21st century. It continues to grow at a rapid pace. Although per capita income has been less robust, per capita income growth. But there needs to be a focus on reducing poverty and growing both agriculture, the services sector, as well as the modern sector.